Hi, my name is Frank Martinelli, and I'll be your presenter today. I'm part of the team working with SDC on development of its advocacy initiative. As we get started, I'd like to thank you for taking time to view this video. This is the first program in a learning series offered by SDC. I'll tell you more about the series in a moment. The SDC Advocacy Initiative comes at the right time. This is the moment in Milwaukee to be talking about advocacy. The continuing impact of the pandemic, the severe economic hardship experienced by so many Milwaukeeans, and the renewed and long overdue calls for racial and economic justice make advocacy important like never before. And let's remember that even before the pandemic, Milwaukee was one of the poorest and most racially segregated cities in America. There is now greater community awareness of the need to finally get to the deep root causes of the many problems facing people served by SDC, and advocacy is one of the powerful ways to tackle these root causes. So let me tell you about the training series. The series is made up of short videos that will cover the following topics. We'll start with a brief introduction to the advocacy initiative. Then we'll look at advocacy and describe some of the forms it can take. Then we'll talk about why SDC has decided to deepen its commitment to advocacy with a focus on tackling the deep root causes of poverty. And we'll look at how SDC will go about building its organizational capacity for effective advocacy, including the who and how of decision-making, how issues will be selected for advocacy, and more. And then we'll also examine the roles that SDC Commission members, staff, community partners, and residents can play in future advocacy efforts. In this first program, we'll cover the advocacy initiative, forms of advocacy, why SDC has decided to deepen its commitment to advocacy, and we'll look at the difference between transactional change and transformational change as the key to tackling the deep root causes of poverty. Let's begin with the SDC Advocacy Initiative. It's a year-long effort to build the internal organizational capacity to equip SDC for continued effective mission-aligned advocacy and to launch the initiative by the end of 2021. Advocacy is not something new to SDC, though. Established in 1963, over the years, SDC has been involved in advocacy in its many forms, like educating decision makers, the public, and the media on critical community issues, building relationships with other organizations to engage in coalition efforts to address poverty, as well as nonpartisan voter registration and educational activities and legislative lobbying. And so the advocacy initiative, rooted in SDC's new strategic plan, will build on its past experience to target the deep root causes of poverty in the greater Milwaukee community. The initiative has 5 main objectives. First, train, develop, and involve SDC leadership in mission-aligned advocacy, and this video training series is part of this first objective. Then develop an organizational decision-making framework for advocacy, identify key issues for advocacy by assessing community needs, plan and implement advocacy strategies to tackle selected issues, and lay the foundation to assure the long-term sustainability of SDC's advocacy initiatives. So let's start by defining advocacy. There are 3 basic forms of advocacy. First, broad advocacy, educating policymakers, the media, and the public about critical issues. Next, legislative advocacy or lobbying, working for or against a piece of legislation. and election-related activities like voter registration, education, and getting people to the polls. The important point is that the law allows nonprofits to engage in all of these activities. Let's take a closer look at all three. Starting with broad advocacy, all types of nonprofits are allowed to educate policymakers, the media, and the public about issues that are important to their mission, as long as this work is nonpartisan, meaning the organization can't express support for or opposition to specific candidates or pieces of legislation. And then legislative advocacy or lobbying. This can include drafting legislation, working for or against a specific piece of legislation as well. Most nonprofits are allowed to engage in a limited amount of legislative lobbying. Now, there are some limitations on how much legislative lobbying is permitted, and there is some record keeping required. But again, the important point is that this advocacy, this form of advocacy is allowable within defined limits. And then election-related activities. Nonprofit organizations can engage in nonpartisan voter registration, education, and turnout activities. Again, this work has to be nonpartisan, not supporting or opposing a specific candidate or set of candidates or a political party. Here's a graphic from an advocacy guide developed by the Michigan Nonprofit Association and the Council of Michigan Foundations. Again, it shows us that advocacy can take many different forms. When we often talk about advocacy, even though the focus is on legislative and voter engagement, this graphic reminds us that advocacy can include many other activities. And some of these other activities can be ways for nonprofits who are new to advocacy to test the waters before engaging in, for example, legislative lobbying. Let's talk a little more about the different forms of advocacy in terms of what the law allows and doesn't allow nonprofits to do. The following information has been prepared by the Stand for Your Mission campaign organized by the National Training Group BoardSource. Let's start with what's definitely okay. We can educate the public and decision makers about SDC's work in a nonpartisan way. We can share information about how public dollars support SDC's work and the communities it serves. And we can also communicate how other issues impact SDC efforts to address poverty in the greater Milwaukee area. Let's continue with other activities that are allowable and need to be carried out within some guidelines and limitations. We can register and educate voters on the issues that are important to them. And we can hold candidate forums. We can name legislators who support or oppose a specific piece of legislation, and we can engage in limited lobbying on behalf of our organization. Again, as we mentioned earlier, such activities are allowable, but they can't be partisan. That is, demonstrating support of or opposition to specific candidates. We can also lobby and campaign without limits as private citizens. For example, while I might be a board or staff member of a nonprofit, I could still contact my legislator's office, identify myself as one of their constituents, and state that I'm calling to express support for a particular piece of legislation. This is an example of lobbying and campaigning as a private citizen. And then finally, here are the activities that are not allowed at all. Organizational support of or opposition to a candidate or a set of candidates, and spending federal grant funds on lobbying. Now let's talk about why SDC has decided to deepen its commitment to advocacy. There are many reasons for why SDC has decided to deepen its commitment. First, advocacy is a powerful way to advance SDC's mission. Next, policymakers need SDC's knowledge and expertise, and advocacy is a way to share that expertise with them. Another reason, government decisions affect the funding and regulation of organizations like SDC, and we know that years of progress can be completely wiped out with the passage of one bad law. Advocacy is also a way to build relationships and power with influential decision makers and policymakers in our communities. And finally, advocacy is important because we know direct services to individuals, while important, they alone do not change the underlying unjust systems that create the need for direct services in the first place. And we'll talk more about this in just a moment. So we're really trying to say that it's not an either-or question. It's not, should we provide direct services to individuals or should we do advocacy? Rather, what we're really called to do is ask ourselves the following questions. How can advocacy expand our mission impact? How can telling policymakers and the public about our issues enhance other organizational efforts? And what is the right balance among services, advocacy, and other activities for SDC? Now let's talk about some of the key issues and ideas that are the foundation of SDC's advocacy initiative. Taken together, these ideas and issues describe a very unique and important approach. First off, SDC's advocacy initiative is rooted in its new strategic plan. It's not an effort off to the side, it's at the core of what SDC intends to do. Another idea, viewing advocacy as a mission impact multiplier. Think of it as a formula. Direct services plus advocacy equals increased mission impact. Another key idea, advocacy informed and inspired by the authentic voices of the community. This is important because sometimes advocacy efforts can be top-down instead of being really guided by the community itself. And this kind of involvement can also lead to engagement of community residents in advocacy roles themselves. Another key idea is the focus on deep systems change. While advocating for individuals in need is important and it must continue, right now we're not talking about individual advocacy. We're talking about advocacy that leads to deeper systems change. The focus of the SDC Advocacy Initiative is changing underlying systems that don't work for all and create the need for services to individuals who are hurt by these systems. We're talking now about systems change, and so it's important to be clear about what systems are we actually talking about. Often when people talk about systems change and social change, they're really talking about the systems that deliver direct services to individuals in need, making changes so that needed services get to people efficiently and effectively. And of course, this is absolutely essential. But improving service delivery systems alone is not the same as changing the underlying systems in our community that create the need for direct services in the first place. The systems we're referring to are the economic, educational, criminal justice, healthcare, and political systems. The focus of SDC's advocacy will be on transformational change at this underlying systems level. It's very helpful to think about systems advocacy in terms of the difference between transactional change and transformational change. Transactional change largely works within an existing set of institutional and system arrangements that often don't operate to benefit everybody. Transactional change focuses on the individual who experiences a problem or negative condition associated with poverty. In the transactional change mode, the key question we might ask ourselves is, why is this individual person or family poor? Our response to a question like this is to offer that person or that family programs, services, and supports to reduce the impact of a problem or negative condition they experience because of poverty. Transformational changes are more fundamental changes in the deep structures and systems that shape negative group outcomes like poverty. Transformational changes are more durable and lasting over time. They have greater effect as the cause of problems are alleviated, not just the symptoms of problems. Transformational changes focus on the systems and the structures that create conditions that negatively affect individuals and families. In the transformational change mode, the key question we ask ourselves is, why is there persistent and widespread poverty in Milwaukee? What is it about the way Milwaukee is structured that results in persistent and widespread poverty experienced in particular by people of color? We ask ourselves, who benefits from the current systems? Who is hurt by the current systems? And what changes in the system are needed? As a result of efforts to uncover deep root causes, we learn more about existing systems, structures, laws, regulations, and policies that hurt the people SDC serves. Based on this shared new knowledge, we can then take action through advocacy to change or eliminate those systems, structures, laws, regulations, and policies. Another key idea that guides SDC's advocacy initiative is the focus on building internal capacity for effective advocacy. We can't successfully engage in advocacy if we're not organized for it. But here's the challenge. Right now, we're not organized internally for effective advocacy and public policy work. So the important question is, how do we start? SDC does not yet have the infrastructure in place for future advocacy and public policy work, so that's part of our effort. Let's take a look now at some of the internal organizational building blocks of effective advocacy that SDC aims to put into place. There are several elements. Let me walk through them quickly now. In future videos, we'll go into these building blocks in more detail. First, leadership needs to make a clear commitment to advocacy. We see this in the SDC Commissioner's decision to make advocacy an important part of the new strategic plan. Next, establish an advocacy leadership team to guide the work. Define internal decision-making processes for advocacy. Educate and train board, staff, and community partners in advocacy. Determine future staffing needs to support advocacy efforts. Build a revenue base to support advocacy. Determine issues for advocacy, including establishing a public policy agenda, developing an advocacy work plan, and then evaluating our results over time. In the second video, we'll focus on how SDC is building internal organizational capacity for effective advocacy and how SDC leadership will make decisions about SDC's roles in future advocacy initiatives. We'll also talk about the roles of board and staff in this internal decision making. And this will include an overview of the SDC Advocacy Policy and Decision Tree recently approved by the Board of Commissioners. So this concludes the first video. Thanks again for viewing it. Look for information in the near future about the next parts in the video series. Since this is the first video, we'd really like to know what you thought of it. Give us your feedback and let us know if you have any questions about advocacy and SDC's advocacy plans.